They actually thought they could bleed me dry over the sound of a rooster, slapping a $500 fine on my worn kitchen counter because the natural, God-given sound of morning was somehow violating the sterile, manicured silence of their million-dollar suburban paradise. And before this whole nightmare finally burned itself to the ground, I ended up seizing their entire community clubhouse, dropping concrete barriers across their freshly paved parking lot in the dead of night, and watching with a cup of black coffee in my hand as their tyrannical, fake-smiling president was shoved into the back of a county cruiser, her expensive designer suit wrinkling under the heavy hands of the law. This kind of petty, manufactured tyranny is a disease that's infecting neighborhoods coast to coast, turning neighbors into informants and homes into prisons. But they made a catastrophic miscalculation when they decided to target my land, a piece of earth that runs so deep in my blood, I can feel its pulse in my own veins. My name is Elias Thorne, and I am a third-generation cattleman running a humble but proud spread just outside of Bozeman, Montana, right where the rugged peaks of the Rockies start to give way to the sprawling, breathing valleys of Gallatin County. My grandfather secured these 50 acres back in 1968, pouring his hard-earned military pension and every ounce of his post-war grit into soil that was unforgiving but honest, building a life out of timber and sweat. And every single morning of my life, I wake up to the haunting, melodic chime of his rusted iron wind catchers on the wraparound porch, breathing in the intoxicating, rich aroma of sweet alfalfa, worn saddle leather, and the damp earth of the barn he raised with his bare, calloused hands. This ranch is not just an asset on a spreadsheet. It is the living, breathing history of my family, the very foundation where my two teenagers, Maya and Leo, spent their golden childhood summers learning the unforgiving weight of a post-hole digger, the delicate art of calming a spooked mare, and the silent, stoic responsibility of stewarding the land. After the bitter, echoing silence that followed my divorce last winter, this dusty patch of Montana became my sanctuary, the only stable anchor in a modern world that seems absolutely obsessed with paving over everything genuine and replacing it with plastic, hollow imitations of life. But as the years crept by, the relentless, sprawling shadow of urban development began creeping toward our borders, bringing with it a plague of developers circling like starved vultures, tearing up the old farm-to-market dirt roads to make way for a sprawling, soulless labyrinth of identical, overpriced McMansions that sprang from the earth like invasive weeds after a flash flood, collectively known as Oak Creek Crossing. Along with these massive, gray brick monoliths came the perfectly chemically treated lawns, the restrictive covenants, and a new breed of residents who somehow believed that the smell of livestock and the crowing of birds at dawn was a personal, targeted assault on their delicate sensibilities. Enter Eleanor Vance, the newly self-appointed president of the Oak Creek Board, a retired corporate litigator who relocated from some sterile, concrete jungle in Seattle, always patrolling the neighborhood in a pristine, blindingly white Range Rover, wielding her law degree like a loaded weapon and genuinely believing that her position gave her the divine right to micromanage the breathing habits of everyone within a 10-mile radius. She was the kind of woman who spoke in a high, breathy register whenever she was lying through her teeth, her lips stretched into a tight, predatory smile that never quite made it up to her cold, calculating eyes, her heavy, floral perfume leaving a suffocating trail that clashed violently with the honest, sharp scent of cattle and mountain air. The harassment didn't start with a bang, but rather a slow, suffocating trickle, beginning with brightly colored violation notices zip-tied aggressively to my rusted front gate, citing completely fabricated complaints about livestock odor, declaring my grandfather's historic, century-old timber barn an unsightly, unapproved structure, and levying excessive noise fines for my animals simply existing as they had since before her subdivision was even a blueprint. Then came the creeping paranoia of the daily surveillance, with Eleanor idling her massive SUV at the edge of my property line, the dark-tinted windows rolling down just enough for her to snap photos with her phone, the slow, deliberate clicking of her high heels on the asphalt echoing like the ticking of a bomb. The certified letters started burying my mailbox, demanding immediate, ruinous payments of $500 a day, threatening to place liens against land that had belonged to my family decades before her precious, artificial lake was ever excavated, leaving our weary, kind-hearted postman, Arthur Jenkins, shaking his head in silent, shared misery every time he had to hand me another thick, legally worded envelope. The true, agonizing sting, however, wasn't the financial threat. It was the surgical, deliberate social isolation of my children, watching as Maya and Leo were suddenly, quietly uninvited from neighborhood bonfires, seeing former friends avert their eyes in the aisles of the local grocery store, feeling the cold, silent ostracization that Eleanor had masterminded to break my spirit. But the universe has a funny way of dealing out karma, and I found the smoking gun purely by a stroke of chaotic luck when old Arthur accidentally slipped a piece of mail intended for the house down the road into my rusted box. And as I glanced at the torn flap, I saw a string of emails between Eleanor and a massive commercial entity called Summit Vista Enterprises. As my eyes scanned the sterile, corporate jargon, my blood turned to ice, realizing that this wasn't about property values or aesthetics. It was a multi-million-dollar, profit-sharing conspiracy to force me into foreclosure, seize my ranch, rezone the 50 acres for a massive commercial shopping complex, and line the pockets of the board members, all operating under an aggressive, brutal timeline to deliver my home to their investors within the year. Every single citation, every sideways glance, every whisper campaign had been a meticulously coordinated psychological war, and the absolute betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest when I saw the name of sweet, elderly Mrs. Gable, the woman who baked us pecan pies every Thanksgiving, listed as one of the primary informants, documenting our comings and goings for the board. They thought they were dealing with some uneducated, easily intimidated rustic holdout, failing to realize that the one thing a Montana cattleman does better than anyone else is dig his heels into the dirt and fight back when a predator threatens his herd. And so, the war officially ignited on a freezing Tuesday when I woke up to find fluorescent yellow stop work orders plastered across my fences, claiming I was operating an illegal, toxic agricultural facility. By Wednesday afternoon, the local news anchor was standing at the edge of my driveway, pointing a camera at my historic barn as if it were a nuclear fallout zone, fed by anonymous tips from concerned neighbors, while the local neighborhood app devolved into a digital witch hunt, filled with hysterical, exaggerated posts from Eleanor's loyal foot soldiers lamenting their plummeting property values. The county building inspector arrived with a clipboard and a heavy sigh, smelling of cheap diner coffee and regret, spending 4 exhaustive hours combing through my acreage only to find absolutely zero code violations, followed closely by the fire marshal, a gruff, honest veteran named Captain Miller, who looked at my perfectly legal, permitted brushburn pile, looked back at the sprawling McMansions, and muttered under his breath about people having far too much money and far too little. Common sense. I knew playing defense would only prolong my execution, so I spent my entire weekend buried in the suffocating, dusty basement archives of the Gallatin County Courthouse, flipping through fragile, yellowed plat maps and original incorporation charters under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, desperately hunting for a chink in their polished armor. What I found in a 1968 land survey made my heart hammer violently against my ribs, a truth so explosive I had to read the fading ink 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. The pristine, luxury community clubhouse, complete with its Olympic-sized pool and the sprawling, newly paved parking lot, was sitting squarely on 2.3 acres of land that belonged entirely, legally, and undeniably to my family. My grandfather had granted the developers a temporary, conditional recreational easement for the community to use the open field, a revocable permission slip that strictly prohibited the transfer of actual ownership, meaning this tyrannical, arrogant HOA had just spent nearly $50,000 of their residents' money grading, paving, and landscaping property that I owned outright. The following Monday, I quietly reached out to my old college buddy Caleb, who now ran the most reputable commercial surveying firm in the valley, and by Wednesday, his crew was out there in the freezing dawn, driving bright orange steel property pins into the frozen earth right at the edge of the clubhouse doors, mathematically confirming what the ancient courthouse records had promised. There is a specific, razor-sharp thrill in discovering that your enemy has built their entire fortress on your land, especially knowing that under Montana real estate law, their claim of adverse possession was completely voided because my grandfather's original easement legally constituted permission, meaning they could never legally claim the dirt beneath their expensive, heated swimming pool. I immediately drove to the next town over to retain Clara Higgins, a brilliant, ruthless property rights attorney who operated out of an office that smelled of lemon polish and old leather. And as I laid the survey maps across her heavy mahogany desk, a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face, confirming that we had a nuclear option, but advising me to let them continue spending their funds improving my parking lot before we dropped the hammer. Meanwhile, a quiet, underground rebellion was brewing as the original, long-term residents of the area, the ones who had lived there before the luxury homes arrived, began sneaking over to my porch in the dead of night, bringing files, old letters, and their own horror stories of Eleanor's reign of terror. My ranch slowly transformed into a war room, filled with people like Frank, a retired Marine, Martha from the county records department, and Hank, a local electrician, all sharing hushed, angry stories over steaming mugs of black coffee, painting a terrifying picture of a corrupted board that used selective enforcement, phantom fees, and outright extortion to force out anyone who didn't fit their wealthy, pristine demographic. But Eleanor, blinded by her own hubris and desperate to meet the developer's deadline, doubled down on her lunacy, calling an emergency, closed-door session to propose a special assessment tax on all residents just to fund a legal action committee against my property, spreading vicious, baseless rumors about my mental stability and anonymously calling the state agricultural department to report a fictitious outbreak of foot-and-mouth disease in my herd. The state vet, a seasoned professional named Dr. Harrison, spent hours trudging through the mud to inspect perfectly healthy cattle, leaving with an exhausted, apologetic shake of his head, muttering about the profound waste of taxpayer resources, but the relentless, daily barrage of bureaucrats, letters, and whispers was wearing me down to the bone. The psychological warfare peaked when a massive, brick-thick envelope arrived by courier, officially serving me with a lawsuit from Summit Vista Enterprises and the HOA jointly, demanding $47,000 in accumulated, fabricated fines, threatening immediate foreclosure and total asset seizure under the guise of nuisance abatement. They didn't just stop at the legal threats. They took out a full-page, humiliating public notice in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, dragging my family's proud, generations-old name through the proverbial mud for the entire county to read, while simultaneously sending anonymous, deeply concerning letters to my children's high school counselors, questioning my fitness as a single father and suggesting my home was an unstable, dangerous environment. The taste of pure, unadulterated parental rage is something metallic and suffocating, a primal, violent instinct that makes you want to tear the world apart with your bare hands. But instead of losing my temper, I unleashed Clara, who immediately filed massive, sweeping discovery motions, legally demanding every single email, bank statement, and private communication the board had produced over the last 5 years. When the local feed store owner, a giant of a man we called Big Jim, pulled me into his back office to show me an anonymous, typed letter he'd received claiming I was violent and demanding he cut off my supply lines, I realized they were actively trying to starve my animals to break me, a realization that was cemented when I woke up at 2 in the morning to find my heavy steel cattle gates mysteriously cut open. My entire herd was wandering blindly across the meticulously manicured greens of the subdivision's private golf course, tearing up the expensive turf, and as Eleanor proudly paraded a local news crew through the damage the next morning, playing the victim of my negligent, aggressive farming. She had no idea that my newly upgraded, hidden infrared security cameras had captured crystal clear, high-definition footage of her own nephew, Tyler Vance, using bolt cutters on my heavy chains in the dead of night. But the absolute, undeniable breaking point, the moment the gloves came off and the earth shifted beneath our feet, happened on a foggy Wednesday at dawn, when the horrifying, mechanical roar of low-flying helicopters shook my walls, and I stumbled out onto my porch in my boots to find my entire driveway swarming with heavily armed tactical units, the red and blue strobes of a dozen sheriff's cruisers cutting through the morning mist. Someone, using a burner phone, had tipped off the federal task force that I was running a massive, industrial-scale methamphetamine lab out of my grandfather's barn. An accusation so utterly absurd and dangerously malicious that even the raid commander, Detective Sarah Jenkins, looked physically pained and highly skeptical as she apologized, stepping around bales of hay and smelling nothing but horse manure and old tractor oil. What made my vision blur with sheer, homicidal rage wasn't the violation of the search itself, but the sight of a random pedestrian, who just happened to have a broadcast-quality camera rig, standing at the edge of the county road, filming the entire humiliation, ensuring that by noon, my face was plastered across every screen in the state as a suspected drug kingpin, a targeted, devastating blow that triggered my terrified ex-wife to file an emergency, ex-parte custody motion to take my kids away from me. The suffocating darkness of that week felt like a physical weight crushing my lungs, but the dawn was coming, and it arrived in the trembling, wrinkled hands of the late postman's widow, Widow Jenkins, who showed up on my porch clutching a weathered, dusty cardboard box like it was the Holy Grail itself. Inside that box, preserved for decades by her husband, were the original, unredacted 1968 neighborhood planning minutes, explicitly confirming that my grandfather had fiercely, legally blocked any permanent transfer of the clubhouse land. A document so powerful that Clara practically vibrated with predatory excitement as she immediately filed a quiet title action, backed by a devastating forensic accounting report crafted by Caleb's tech-savvy brother, Dexter. Dexter had traced the digital footprints of the anonymous emails and fake social media profiles right back to a PR firm paid directly by the HOA's defense fund, while the forensic audit revealed a staggering, nauseating truth. The board was missing over $340,000 in community funds, and Eleanor's personal law firm was slated to receive a massive, hidden $285,000 consulting bonus from Summit Vista Enterprises the moment my ranch was foreclosed and handed over to the developers. We didn't just leak the information. We orchestrated a public execution of their corruption, waiting in silent, terrifying anticipation for the emergency county town hall meeting that the commissioners had called to address the ranch crisis, an event that packed the community center with hundreds of furious, divided residents, local politicians, and half a dozen news crews buzzing with frantic energy. Eleanor sat at the front table, her posture rigid, her designer suit impeccable, whispering frantically to her high-priced defense attorneys, completely unaware that she was walking into a slaughterhouse. And as I took the microphone, staring out at the sea of faces, the sheer, crushing silence of the room felt like the agonizing, breath-holding moment before a massive thunderstorm breaks. I didn't yell, I didn't curse. I just let the massive projector screens behind me do the talking, lighting up the dark room with the time-stamped, undeniable security footage of her nephew planting fake drug paraphernalia in my barn hours before the SWAT raid, followed immediately by the chilling, undeniable audio recordings of board members casually discussing their illegal kickbacks and plans to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. The collective gasp that sucked the oxygen from the room was the sweetest music I had ever heard in my life, a sound that only grew louder as federal FBI agent David Brooks stepped out from the shadows of the back row, his badge flashing under the harsh fluorescent lights, announcing calmly into his own microphone that a multi-agency federal grand jury had just authorized immediate indictments for wire fraud, civil rights violations, and racketeering against 5 members of the board. As Eleanor's face drained of all color, her arrogant facade shattering into a million pathetic pieces as she shrieked about a witch hunt, I leaned into the microphone one last time, my voice echoing like a gunshot, and informed the entire room that as the legal, undisputed owner of the very ground we were standing on, I was invoicing the HOA for $47,000 in back rent, and that their clubhouse, their pool, and their parking lot were officially closed for business. The sheer, unadulterated chaos that erupted was legendary, a standing ovation of tears, shouting, and raw, cathartic relief from a community that had been held hostage for years, culminating in the deeply satisfying, cinematic sight of Eleanor Vance being handcuffed right there in the aisle, her legal career, her reputation, and her entire fraudulent empire burning to ashes in real time. 3 years have passed since the night the empire fell, and the crisp, clean air over Oak Creek Crossing feels different now, lighter, free from the suffocating grip of corporate greed and neighborhood tyranny. Eleanor is currently sitting in a federal penitentiary, serving a hard sentence for conspiracy and fraud, stripped of her law license, and drowning in restitution debt, while the developers cut their losses, paid a massive, multi-million-dollar federal settlement, and fled the state of Montana entirely. Our ranch hasn't just survived. It has thrived beyond my wildest dreams, expanding its borders, launching a massive, fully funded agricultural scholarship for local kids, and becoming a bustling, joyous hub for veterans, while the neighborhood, now run by a transparent, honest committee, leases the clubhouse land from me for exactly $1 a year, a daily reminder of who really holds the power. I sit on my porch now, watching the sun dip behind the rugged peaks, my kids laughing in the distance, knowing that we didn't just save a piece of dirt, we drew a line in the sand and reminded the world that the American spirit cannot be bought, bullied, or broken by people in expensive suits. But as the wind rustles through the old pines, a lingering, unsettling question remains, hovering in the quiet dusk. In a society that constantly rewards ruthless corporate aggression and incentivizes the absolute destruction of the little guy for a profit margin, is the law actually designed to protect the innocent, or does justice only exist for those stubborn, crazy, and resilient enough to drag it out of the darkness and force it into the light with their own two hands?
And we are at the end of the videos. I hope you had a great time watching it. If you had any feedback or suggestion for the future videos, drop them in the comment below. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching and see you next time.